morning. I'm Melissa Harris Perry. The new job numbers just released yesterday tell an interesting tale. Unemployment ticked up to 7.3%, even though employers added far more jobs than economists had predicted, 204,000 new jobs. But government jobs slipped by another 12,000, meaning nearly 100,000 public sector jobs have been lost this year alone. Americans are hungry for substantive work. Steel-cut oatmeal with bananas, if you will. But our Fruit Loops lawmakers are on a short-term sugar high of deficit reduction. Joining me today, Avik Roy, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and former policy advisor to Governor Mitt Romney, and Claire McKenna, policy analyst with the National Employment Law Project. Peter Goodman, executive business editor and global news editor of the Huffington Post and author of Past Due, The End of Easy Money and the Renewal of the American Economy. And finally, Heather McGhee, the vice president of policy and outreach at Demos. So nice to have you all here with your bowls of Fruit Loops in front of you. Let me ask you about that ideological aspect, particularly the extent to which I think even we heard from the president's administration early on a discourse of a need to do two things: to reduce the deficit and to cut spending, and that those things would generate more profits for private industry, create more security within the business community, and make more jobs. But the deficit is ticking down pretty dramatically. We have made enormous cuts as a result of sequester. And in fact, jobs are, we saw unemployment tick up by a tiny bit in this last quarter. Isn't that indicative that that ideology is simply empirically false?
I wouldn't say that. I would agree with Peter's characterization, which is that we're seeing a two-tiered recovery. The investor class is doing very well because of the sugar high of monetary policy. The Federal Reserve is pumping money into the economy, and that's particularly benefiting banks and investors and people who own housing. But for the middle class, they're being hammered by the fact that the cost of hiring people has increased because of expanded regulations, expanded taxes on smaller businesses, and that's what's making it hard for businesses to hire. So what you're seeing is a lot of businesses aren't hiring, or they're moving people into part-time work, and part-time work is less stable.
But businesses are hiring. That's part of what those numbers showed, is that we were expecting about 120,000 new jobs. We end up with 204, but yet we still see unemployment tick up, in part because it's the public sector that is shedding them. And that's not about increased regulation would make more government jobs if there were more.
With the government. You would also think with the story that you're telling that corporate profits weren't at near record highs. Yeah. So the story of that businesses really just don't have the money to hire people because of the onerous regulation and taxes isn't borne out by corporate profits being at a record high.
So the thing is that there's uncertainty in the economy, right? There's uncertainty about regulation. There's uncertainty about future taxes due to fiscal instability. And people are saying, if my taxes are going up next year or the year after, do I want to invest in hiring someone where that's a long-term
cost? Well, I certainly agree that uncertainty is high, but I might suggest that I think that uncertainty comes from things, for example, like the government shutdown. It's been 9 months since President Obama issued his call to Congress in February in his State of the Union address.
Tonight, let's declare that in the wealthiest nation on earth, no one who works full-time should have to live in poverty, and raise the federal minimum wage to $9 an hour. Let's tie the minimum wage to the cost of living so that it finally becomes a wage you can live on.
I love Boehner's face during that. Look, since then, Congress has responded to that call, well, pretty much with the same nothing that they've done about the federal minimum wage since the last increase in 2007. But this week, the minimum wage got some attention in Washington as the White House threw its support behind a Senate bill that would increase the current $7.25 federal wage to as much as $10.10 per hour. Democrats may advance the bill to the Senate floor before the Thanksgiving break, according to Politico.com. But without support from Senate Republicans, the bill would fall short of the 60-vote supermajority needed to break a GOP filibuster. Unfortunately for workers, fortunately for workers, the states aren't simply waiting on Congress to act. On Tuesday, New Jersey became the 5th state to add a minimum wage to its constitution after voters approved a ballot measure to increase the state's minimum to $8.25 an hour. The vote also made New Jersey the 11th state to implement automatic minimum wage adjustments tied to the increase in inflation. I mean, Avik, almost always if we do a minimum wage story, what happens is someone brings a small business owner, almost always, in fact, the same small business owner, to the table, and they say, if you raise minimum wages, I'm not, if you raise minimum wage, I'm not going to be able to hire. It's going to have this negative impact on my business. And then increasingly, we're seeing reports that say, no, actually, that's not what happens. We've seen minimum wages increase before. Is this just an ideological question about the unwillingness to raise the minimum wage?
No, so the empirical literature is pretty overwhelming that if you increase the cost or increase minimum wage, you increase the cost of hiring, and therefore you have less jobs. If I have $100,000,
that's demonstrably untrue. That's just simply that is flatly untrue.
Overwhelming.
You can look at the literature.
Yeah,
in Washington State, to pick one example, the minimum wage went up, employment went up. I mean, that's just not true.
To repeat, the overwhelming economic literature is that raising the cost of minimum wage.
Saying it twice doesn't make it true. That's just flatly a lie. That's the lie that's at the heart of the war against working people.
You can interrupt me, but the thing is, we'll have the opportunity now with New Jersey. We can see if New Jersey's economy, what happens to those minimum wage jobs. 99% of all full-time jobs pay more than the minimum wage. So what you're doing is you're affecting things at the margins for young people who have higher unemployment in this economy.
But it's not young people. I mean, I know that story, and there was a time in America where that was accurate, when it was young people working, seasonal jobs for the minimum wage. But increasingly, it's actually people making their whole lives on minimum wage.
That's right. I mean, overwhelmingly, a majority of adults, of people earning the minimum wage, are over 20 years old. And, most of the rigorous economic research over the last 20 years shows that minimum wage increases really have no discernible effect on job loss. And the thing is, you have to consider, too, that there are efficiency costs to consider.
The story of unemployment in America is told largely in 30-day increments on the first Friday of every month when the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases its monthly jobs report. But beneath the headlines about jobs added and percentage point increases is a more persistent truth about the American labor market. Black unemployment is higher than Hispanic unemployment, which itself is higher than white unemployment. This hasn't just been true for the last year or the last decade. It's been true for the last 4 decades and beyond. Since 1973, the story of the U.S. workforce has always looked like this: unchanging racial stratification in which African Americans have consistently had the highest levels of unemployment, followed by Latinos with the lowest rates of joblessness among white Americans.
One of the things that was interesting about that chart you had up is that Asian unemployment was lower than white unemployment. And I think that's something that's nice that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is now measuring, because for a long time they didn't measure the difference between Asians. And I think it's important to understand that to the degree that there are ethnic disparities or racial disparities, Asians are actually doing pretty well, and that's worth studying. It's worth learning from why Asians are doing well and outperforming whites on a lot of these measures.
Yeah, although it is true that in terms of wealth, so that's the unemployment numbers, but in terms of wealth, we saw actually a faster decrease of Asian American wealth in the context of this particular economic downturn. And we know that wealth is that cushion that protects people from economic downturns.